Spoilers for the 4.0 Archon quests and World Quests Ancient Colors and Book of Esoteric Revelations. Genshin is back to being a horror game. Human experimentation, people dissolving, ghosts getting revenge on their murderer, ominous magic circles, and some crybaby ate some alchemical abyss dragon corpse created by the great sinner Gold, and now he's on a mission to mind meld the entirety of Fontaine to avoid the end of the world. Let me back up. In the Archon quest, it's revealed that 20 years ago, Vacher's beloved Finier accidentally dissolved in Primordial Waters. So Vacher did the most rational thing possible in this situation. For the past 2 decades, he's been kidnapping and dissolving young women in an attempt to find a way to undissolve his love. He also ended up creating an entire drug cartel for synth, which is a dilute form of Primordial Waters. Completely reasonable response. It's unclear to me if this mysterious organization of his is totally done for, or if they'll reemerge as a big bad in the future. But I wonder about the latter specifically because there is a mention in some papers that these experiments on Primordial Waters are derived from the research notes of a certain Jakob Ingold. We've actually known about Jakob since patch 3.6, and we even end up meeting him. And he's cooking up some sort of plot. The Narzissenkreuz Institute, not to be confused with the Ordo, was originally an orphanage and school for gifted youngsters. There are a few key names to remember here: Rene, Jakob, Alain, and Mary Ann. Around or at the tail end of the Cataclysm, the vice director of the Narzissenkreuz Institute, Basil Elton, returned to her position as naval commander to fight a threat. She would perish in battle, and the Institute would disband, but before she left, she entrusted Rene and Jakob to the care of Carl Ingold, and Alain and Marianne to Alain Guillotin. So this is also the origin of the founder of the Fontaine Research Institute. Rene, Jakob, and Mr. Carl would go on an expedition to Sumeru. Here, Rene discreetly researched Conrian technology, as well as Kavarna and abyssal power. I made a video about his investigation notes if you want more detail on that. Rene, Jakob, and Alain would all eventually join the Institute of Natural Philosophy, while Marianne would covertly join the Marshal Say Fontaine with her Blade Wolf protector Seymour. I'm going to make a separate video on a more detailed timeline and history of these characters and the allegories within the Narzissenkreuz Adventure Team quest. But for now, here's what you need to know. During his visit to Sumeru, Rene calculated a world formula, or a prophecy, predicting the end of the world. His obsession with this prediction led him and Jakob down a dark and twisted path, and they would eventually form the Narzissenkreuz Ordo, a secret society, to prevent this catastrophe. One of the early pursuits of Rene, and still of great interest to Jakob, was research into Elynas. In the world quest Ancient Colors, we meet Jakob Ingold as he bullies a sweet little Melusine who is simply trying to paint amazing art with the blood of her dead father, whose corpse she lives inside. Jakob is after said blood and wants to revive this dead father, who is the great beast Elynas. According to Elynas himself, he once floated in a cold cosmic darkness until his mother wished for him to be born in a wonderful world. He and his siblings left Mother below and came to play on the surface. But he realized that he perceived the world differently. The things that made him happy were terrifying to the world, so he knew he had to be stopped. Elynas first died in the battle with the vice director, in which she also perished. Later, there would be another scuffle between many people, a primordial spirit, and metal animals, which would wound Elynas's corpse. The Melusine were born from this later conflict. The Melusine, much like Elynas, perceived the world differently. For example, Canotila sees Paimon and the Traveler as a rainbow balloon and a beast who could swallow the world, respectively. Sloasi, in trying to describe the color of the sun, settles on black. This is interesting because this is not the first time we've heard of someone or something seeing the world completely different. Festering Desire describes the abyssal dragon Durin as looking to go to Mondstadt and make friends and show them how wonderful he is, while the Skyward series describes him as covetous, venomous, and destructive. But the comparison doesn't stop there. In some enigmatic notes, it says that the internal structure of Elynas is similar to that of rocks from Durin on Dragonspine, which has a warming but toxic property. The notes also compare the scarlet quartz to an oozing concretion. also toxic because it's semi-neutralized forbidden knowledge. So Elynas seems to be very much like Durin, both in how they see the world and their physical abyssal qualities. It doesn't seem like a stretch, then, that Durin is one of the siblings that Elynas references. That makes the mother who made a wish to give him form Rhinedottir. If this is the case, then Gold is mother, which means Albedo would be Elynas' brother, and to the Melusine, he'd be uncle. When you realize this, the fact that Auntie Alice, as Albedo would call her, narrated the part about the Melusine during the 3.8 livestream a while back. Also, interesting that both Mimir and Albedo are artists, and it makes me wonder how Albedo really perceives the world. Okay, so what does all of this have to do with Narzissenkreuz? First off, Rene fed the flesh of Elynas to Jakob, kinda like this consecrated beast having a little rib snack. This was to make Jakob stronger so they could have the power to prevent the disaster of the world formula. And there's also something more thematic going on as well with the world formula. Rene first cooks up this world formula during the expedition in Sumeru, and the Book of Esoteric Revelations documents what happened following. Rene begins by explaining Fortuna, which is a cycle of civilizations rising, then falling, and then rising again. He notes that the concept of Fortuna bears a striking resemblance to his computational scheme, which he calls the world formula. But he's encountered a problem. No matter how many times he recalculates his world formula for this cycle, he can only come to one conclusion. After this civilization falls, there will be no others, unless there's an external variable. He specifies, after a few hundred years, all the birthing waters of the world will dry up, and a few hundred years after that, the world will become as it appears now before us. 3 things. First, this perfectly echoes the words of the fell dragon in the Nymph's Dream artifact set, where the dragon believes himself to be the true hero. "You haven't seen what I've seen, so you just don't get it, man," the dragon says to the hero. "The star beast shall drink the amniotic fluid of the world dry. 100 years from then, all life on its surface shall be wiped away." Second, when we meditate upon the book, we are taken to a place from Rene's memories. This sequence seems to suggest that the space is supposed to be a glimpse of the future Rene foresaw. If that's the case, we could also speculate it's abyssal in nature. Where we saw desolate ruins floating and rift hounds in an endless void, Canatila, who is essentially abyssal in origin, saw trees and flowers and a cute doggy. So perhaps the alien life forms of the abyss are the star beasts. Third, there's another prophecy we know of. It's the conundrum left by the former Hydro Archon that says that the waters will rise and dissolve all the people of Fontaine, leaving Farida all alone crying at her throne. This prophecy sounds nothing like Rene's world formula. In fact, it sounds like the opposite. In one, the waters rise and dissolve. In the other, the waters dry up. But there seems to be a connection. So Rene documents sneaking into Elynas' corpse to study it. He senses the body has a will, similar to how Kavarna and Abyssal Power also have a will. Elynas is not decaying, but simply in a hardened, protective state. It's at this point he's cooking up this idea to use Elynas to enhance Jakob's power. They go through with it despite the risk, and Jakob seems to respond well to the treatment. He does not respond well to Rene jokingly comparing the flesh and blood of Elynas to the jam that they ate at tea time and in Sumeru. Listen, it's a good joke, Rene, even a great joke, but I need you to stop. Rene draws comparisons between Elynas, Durin, and the oozing concretions of the chasm, and notes that ordinary humans cannot withstand it. But 2 types seem to be able to. 1, neo-humans like Jakob, and 2, humans capable of detoxifying it, none of which have yet been found, but I'd guess this category would include Traveler. And as for neo-human, Rene talks at length about using the abyss to transcend mortality, so perhaps this is the neo-human aspect of Jakob he refers to. I mean, Rene would later even experiment with summoning abyssal monsters, and he opens a beastly rift where black monsters shaped like dogs poured out, and notes it's very similar to the passages in Conrian records. As a side note, I do think it's funny that Rhinedottir is called Gold, and Rene's last name is Ingold, and they're kind of doing the same thing. but I digress. But Jakob had this abyssal power potentially as far back as their Sumeru expedition, making him able to ingest Elynas in the first place. Anyway, so Rene is still trying to figure out how to prevent the catastrophe. Jakob's changes fill Rene with inspiration for a more unique approach. As long as they can survive in some form, they don't need to grow mint or anything else to survive, and can start civilization anew. So Rene really leans into this idea of human beings transcending and evolving, using presumably abyssal power. He needs to prove it can work though, so experiments on Carter, who is dying from an incurable illness. It does not work. Carter is rendered immobile and preserved, almost like a zombie it sounds, and horrifyingly, his body will talk even if his vocal cords are cut out, as they regrow after a few days. After this, Rene still looks for ways to save Carter and deflects to other means of transcendence. Enigmatic pages 8 and 9 are filled with really cryptic and esoteric descriptions of these new means, but Rene makes his intent clear. All Fontainians will be able to transcend, shedding the limitations of physical form and separation, and prevent the apocalypse. I shall be the first subject to part, so useless personality can be removed. Farewell, I shall rediscover myself through water, and be reborn through water. Alain and Marianne would also clash with Rene and Jakob over these plans, and this was the conflict that spawned the Melusine. From then on, the notes don't even sound like Rene, unless you were to assume he's no longer really Rene. He's something bigger, maybe as big as a sea. So it sounds like in his research, he found the origin of life, the Primordial Waters. Putting the pieces together, Rene came up with a world formula that postulated that whereas civilizations have risen and fallen, they will not rise again after this cycle. To prevent or really circumvent the disaster, Rene looks toward using the abyss to transcend humans, using Jakob as his prime experiment. This may be ironic if the prophesied destruction is abyssal in nature. Seeing the failure of his current plan, he deflected to a new path. I speculate that this path probably centers around the Primordial Waters, as it involves Fontainians transcending, losing their physical form. So basically, Rene wants to dissolve every person in Fontaine. I propose, then, that this could be the prophecy of the former Hydro Archon. The machinations of Rene and Jakob Ingold, in their attempt to subvert a catastrophe, will create another catastrophe of their own design. The plot surrounding Vacher using the Primordial Waters, then, did not just begin 20 years ago. It began over 400. And similar to how Vacher used Jakob's research notes, I cautiously suspect that Jakob could have been a supplier for Vacher. So perhaps then, maybe, the Narzissenkreuz Ordo plays a larger part of the Archon quest in Fontaine, specifically with the prophecy of dissolving every Fontainian. This is just speculation, but here's some even more wild tinfoil speculation. I've wondered even as far back as 3.6 if Arlecchino herself had something to do with Narzissenkreuz. Especially now that we know she is from Fontaine herself and has a soft spot for orphans. And remember, Narzissenkreuz Institute was an orphanage, and Rene and Jakob themselves were orphans. This is important because Linny tells us that Arlecchino wants to first use the Gnosis to save Fontaine from that prophecy. It remains to be seen whether this is Arlecchino's true intent, as she has been repeatedly described as a wolf in sheep's clothing, but depending on if she did have connections to Rene or Jakob, and if so, what her standing is with the Ordo, this could drastically alter the answer to that question. That's all for now. I'm still cooking on quite a few other things. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I co-host a stream with my friend Owl over on twitch.tv/owletdesu, although we're off until like September 7th. But I'll still be making some more videos in the meantime. Thank you once again, and please take care, and make sure to monthly check your smoke detector and your carbon monoxide detector. Yeah, that's important. Okay, bye!